Okay, good afternoon, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Thursday, August 21st, and what's on your mind? Where do you want to start? The Middle East or
Well,
Russia, Ukraine?
let's start with Russia, Ukraine.
Okay, so what's going on there? It's a bit confusing for me. It sounded I just realized that I've been deluded with all these statements about the potential deals, but then I just realized that none of it is really fitting. It just seems to be noise, like
Yeah,
what's happening here?
right. There may have been some real movement, between the U.S. and Russia, and that may have been solidified in Alaska. We don't know exactly what it is, but we did see a change, a very important change. Again, the Americans, Trump in particular, gave up on the ceasefire. That's something that they had been insisting on, for months and months. Get the Russians to accept a ceasefire, then we'll work from there. And they dropped that requirement, and they've actually adopted Putin's position. Okay, no, we need to have a peace agreement, then a ceasefire. So that's significant. That was real, and so far, Trump is held to that. But then we had this meeting in the White House with Zelensky and with the leaders of, you could say, really the most important European countries, maybe with the exception of Finland. I'm not quite sure why the Finnish president was in there, but they were all there, and that was just noise. I don't think anything was decided. There wasn't any movement forward. I think, if anything, it was really about trying to stop sabotage any agreement, any potential agreement between the U.S. and Russia. And what we saw, I think, was just the Europeans getting their muddy paws all over the agreement and essentially spoiling it, sabotaging it. So there's a lot of talk, about, again, sending troops into Ukraine, immediately following a ceasefire. And it seems like, the Americans got talked into it. At one point, it sounded like, Trump agreed with that, and then he didn't. But then he was talking about providing, air support. Say, well, yeah, we're not going to have no boots on the ground. We're not sending any U.S. troops. That's final, absolute. But we can, support the European troops with our,
Trump said that?
pilots. Yeah. Well, I believe he did. And I know that Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, also made that clear. It was because he said that, yeah, from now on we're selling our arms, and we're going to actually add another 10%, to cover the cost of the air cover that we're going to provide. So this is something that has been agreed upon, or I don't know if it's this is such a chaotic administration. You don't know if it's really been agreed upon or if it's just some of them. I can't be absolutely sure, but I think Trump at one point did say that, but he's been so all over the map on this that it's really hard to know, but what you see, I think that if the Europeans were trying to do anything, it was, I think, was just to again, undo the work that had been done between the Russians and the Americans. And I think they had some success. And again, Trump has held the line on the ceasefire versus, peace agreement issue. But he let the Europeans push all this other nonsense about troops on the ground. And then, his administration is talking about, again, providing air support to these troops. And that's obviously sabotages. That is not something the Russians will ever accept. And they've made it clear. That's something that they have gone out and said, upon hearing these reports, this is not something, that we can accept. They had, that's a position that they held before, the recent Alaska summit, and that's a position that they have restated since the Alaska summit. So by pushing this, the Europeans, whether they realize it or not, are making any kind of peace agreement impossible.
So the idea is that after a peace agreement, then they would put troops in there that would be supported by the United States? Would they be NATO troops that they would put there? Or
Well, okay, I guess they
Chinese troops is what I heard. Some floated as well.
Well, that was something the Russians said that, they said, yeah, they're open to some kind of, some sort of security guarantees for Ukraine, but it wouldn't be, a NATO Article 5 style security guarantee. And that's what the Europeans are talking about. They're just saying, okay, yeah, no NATO, but in fact, they're sort of de facto NATO. We'll send our troops in there. We won't call them NATO troops. They'll be French troops and British troops. And I think Lithuanian troops, I think they've also volunteered. And it's interesting, some countries have said no way, like the Italians and the Poles and the Germans, we're not sending troops. But there are a few countries that have volunteered to send them. And it would just be, it's kind of a technicality. Maybe you don't call them NATO troops. They're the troops but they're troops of member nations, and they amount to the same thing. They would amount to the same thing. Yeah, the mention of the Chinese came from the Russians, who said, okay, yeah, we can do some kind of security guarantee, and, maybe a country such as China could be involved. And that was shot down, or was rejected again by the Europeans. We couldn't possibly have the Chinese involved in this.
Well, if there is any talk about putting any Western troops in Ukraine, we know the deal is dead in the water. So, I mean, is that actually something serious? Trump's not actually, he knows that will kill the deal, right? I mean, he has to know that. So
you would hope so. It just, yeah, again, like I said, he's been all over the map on this thing. And, I think there's nothing firm, about this, but he has let them, he's allowed the Europeans to push this. He hasn't pushed back. And if he himself hasn't said it, his administration is talking about it in air support. And that clearly, goes against anything, the spirit of the Alaska summit. And but this doesn't surprise me. I mean, this is the thing, is that we can get very excited about something, where Trump seems to take a step in one direction. It can make, can cause, our side to applaud and whatever, and to all of a sudden be optimistic. But with Trump, you have to prepare for some sort of, if not a 180, just incredible inconsistency. Say, hey, Trump, did you just agree to this yesterday? And, how can you be talking about this today? This just doesn't work out. This doesn't make any sense. But again, he's just like, he's in a different setting. He's talking to different people, and he's now starting to, the deal or the kind of the framework that maybe he had worked out with Putin is starting to get a little fuzzy in his head. And he's thinking of, he wants to please the people that are in front of him. I saw a Truth Social post from him just recently, in which he derided the Biden administration, for not enabling the Ukrainians to strike into Russia, to go on offense. And he said, you can't win a war if you can never go on offense. And of course, this is not true. The Biden administration famously and, or notoriously, gave the go-ahead to the attack and strikes into pre-2014 Russia. And this was something which was very, very dangerous escalation that, that resulted in the Oreshnik response and threats of, possible strikes on NATO bases. And then it was really because of Trump and his administration. I think they made it clear. Trump himself said this was a stupid idea. And then when he took office, he stuck to that. We actually, because of Trump's position on this, we pulled back from the brink. We were heading in a very dangerous direction. But now we get this Truth Social post that just, is deriding Biden, for not going more on offense. So what are you suggesting, Trump? Is that you're going to give him Tomahawk missiles? It's just not clear. I don't know what's going on. There's just chaos. Chaos comes out of his mouth and chaos comes out of the administration. And it drives me crazy. I think, like most people with an analytical mind, with analysts, try to, make sense of things. And, we want to, we're people who take logical consistency very, very important. and that's the way our minds work. But Trump's mind doesn't work that way. And it can be very frustrating. He made this statement. You want to analyze it and say, okay, what does this mean? This is maybe a new change in policy, and say, no, it's just something that came out of Trump's mouth. That's unfortunately what we're dealing with. So, chaos all around.
Yeah, I think you touched on it, is that he just really wants to please everybody. So just, he talks to Trump and he's like, that was a great meeting at a great time.
Putin. Right.
To Putin. Yeah, sorry, Putin. Yeah. And it seemed like everything was great. And then he talks, then 2 days later, I see Zelensky smiling and thumbs up. And it's like, okay, everything's good here. The only people that maybe he's not trying to please are the European leaders. He doesn't seem to give a damn about them. You can see that photo. Just that was such an embarrassing photo. That really shows the relationship. All right, here's Emperor Trump here with his vassals, and they're all sitting in pull-up chairs around his desk, looking upset, and he's just telling them what It's I think the Europeans, to me, seem to be the biggest. They just look like fools and incompetent. Yeah, just weak. They just don't have any leadership qualities in them. But there is talk. Well, there is talk about Putin and Zelensky meeting directly. Do you think that will actually happen? I mean, that's an improvement, right?
Well, I wouldn't really say it's an improvement. As I frankly, I just don't have any faith in the goodwill, the good intentions of Zelensky. I think for him, it's just going to be all about optics. He's going to plan some sort of, very public denunciation or show of strength, or something like that. He's not there. He doesn't want to negotiate. It's clear that he doesn't. So I don't see anything good of coming out of a meeting such as that. Now the Russians haven't rejected it outright. They're clearly not very interested in it, and they have suggested that that the ground needs to be prepared. We have to get closer before there's any sense in having this meeting. And they've also pointed out that, in their eyes, that Zelensky is not a legitimate leader. He can't sign any documents. But that doesn't prevent them from meeting with him as, the current de facto leader of Ukraine. If they could see some good coming out of it. I don't see any good coming out of it. Now, they might just decide to do it, for their own public relations reasons. They decide that, okay, again, we can demonstrate to our allies and so on and so forth that we're serious about this. Zelensky's milking the Russian reluctance to meet with them for all it's worth, saying, look, they're scared of me. They're not interested in peace. I want to talk to them. And maybe the Russians might just call his bluff on that and say, okay, we'll meet with them, even though we don't think anything will come of it.
I was thinking that even if we had an agreement, somehow reached a deal, whether it's, the Donbass for this in exchange for what they took in Sumy and Kharkov region, and we freeze the lines in Kherson and Zaporozhye, like even if that was the case, I just feel like that wouldn't hold. It's not acceptable, because the problem is, even if Kherson and Zaporozhye were completely under Russian control, I still don't think that would be enough, because the problem is that what about the people in Odessa, or Nikolaev or Kharkov that are mostly Russian speakers, identify as Russian, or that are being persecuted by the Kiev regime. They can't just stay behind that wall, right? I mean, I don't think they will be able to. The guarantee that these people won't be persecuted, I don't think will be able to be enforced, right? Like that. That's a problem. I have a feeling like that this is going to continue until Russia gets to a place where they are no longer wanted in Ukraine, where the local population is once they start to enter Banderite territory. And I'm not sure where that line is exactly, but it's not going to end exactly on these oblasts, right?
Certainly not.
So That's a serious problem, right? How do you think that will mean that the war will continue? I mean, there will be a lot of pressure, especially if Russia is winning and has the ability to, as they use the term, to liberate these areas that they see as Russian people that are in occupied territory. I know that sounds crazy to people that haven't been following the war normally, but that's the way we need to look at it, because this civil war has been going on since 2014. So.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's something that actually the Russians themselves bring up again and again. It's again one of the objectives. An important part of any sort of peace agreement that could conceivably be reached has to address that issue, which is the persecution of Russian speakers within Ukraine. That's a persecution that began well before, the SMO. And even before the coup of 2014, but it certainly accelerated after those two events, and it just continues to this persecution, the suppression, continues to intensify. Now, Odessa is symbolically important, a city founded by Catherine the Great, and it's also the site of a horrible massacre that occurred shortly after the coup. That there were dozens of Russian speakers, who were protesting the coup government, that were burned alive, in a building there in Odessa. And the Russians themselves had said that, that they had to bring the perpetrators to justice. And they probably really, the only way they can, I think, enforce any kind of justice is to liberate Odessa. Putin himself has spoken of Odessa as a Russian city. He hasn't, clearly laid out, say, this is one of our objectives. He named the four oblasts, Zaporozhye, Kherson, and the Donetsk and Lugansk. That's been stated and restated, again and again over the last many months, over their year. They haven't, formally kind of officially designated Nikolaev and Odessa as objectives, but they have they've implied, that maybe this is where they're going to go. I think there have been suggestions that that's where they're going to go. It's not, out there formally, but I think many people in Russia, feel this, these are our Russian brothers and sisters, and we need to go there.
Right.
It's part of what they call Novorossiya. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, there's no way that the Russians could ever get that guarantee that the rights of Russian speakers and ethnic Russians within Ukraine will be protected if this government is in place, because this government's whole sense of being is to destroy anything Russian. That was its whole purpose. That's why the coup happened. That's why this government's in place. That's why we have the ban regime. That's why we have this war. So this government cannot exist, which means that Zelensky can't be in power. So that the idea of any type of peace deal, I think, while Zelensky is in power with Russia, is really just silly. And then we get distracted by these, the possibility bees, but the reality is Trump can't dictate this thing. This is, we don't have that power. We think we can. We're playing this weird role where we're fighting Russia and then we're also mediating with Russia. The whole thing just doesn't make sense. So I think everything is just fugazi, smokes and mirror. And at the end of the day, as long as this Banderite Zelensky government is in power, we're not going to have peace, because that the Russians will, as long as the Banderite's in control, they will still do what they can to kill Russians. So you just have to get that government has to be removed. There has to be some type of election, something like that in place, right? That's the only way that we could have peace.
Yeah, well, I think that's the way, an awful lot of Russians feel. There's no question about it. And I think that's, in general, the way the Kremlin looks at it. There's some suspicions about the Kremlin. Again, people go back and feel like the Kremlin was kind of taken for a ride by the West with the Minsk agreements and other agreements. And Putin himself has kind of admitted to that. He said he trusted them too much. So there's a fear among, many Russians that maybe Putin, because he believes very strongly in international law and agreements and so on and so forth. He actually, that's the way he would prefer to do things. But I think, again, many in Russia see, or share your opinion. It's just like you just simply can't work with these people. They are kind of just incapable of actually abiding by agreement, of the kind that Russia would insist on. In other words, they are about persecuting Russians. So you can't just say, okay, well, why don't you give up this persecution of Russians? It's sort of like asking them to give up their own identity.
Right.
It's like, and I think many in Russia, many within the Kremlin see that. I think, maybe all of them see it, but it's just, there is this fear, this lingering fear that, maybe there's still kind of a residual naivete, within the Kremlin, maybe within Putin himself, even though, clearly Putin's had his eyes open. He himself has talked about how, he's been deceived by the West, but there is this fear that he might actually make an agreement. But I don't even see the chance for it, because even, there is this rumor that came out that was repeated in many different sources and directly by Witkoff again, that it was just like the Russians would agree to a ceasefire if the Ukrainians withdrew from Donbass, and then you could at least temporarily freeze the lines, in the other two oblasts. Now, the Russians again have neither really directly denied or affirmed that, so you don't know what's going on. But there are people in Russia that have feared that, okay, maybe Putin's given in a little bit here. He made it a concession.
I had that fear originally as well. I thought this isn't going to work. What if they actually take that deal, and it's going to be bad?
Right. But it's hard to know what's going on. Sometimes I can't be sure. There are people analysts that I respect that think one way on this issue, and then others, I'm not sure. It's hard. I find it hard to believe that actually the Russians went out and made a firm offer, maybe to kind of break a logjam and get the Americans moving and get them to accept their, position on peace agreements versus the ceasefire. They had to make at least some sort of gesture in that direction. So I said, we could consider that or something, without going so far as to making a definite promise. And then the Americans grabbed that and seized it and kind of went and said, hey, they're offering this or something. Maybe that's what happened. And so it was more of a tactical move and not a real concession. And the reason they're not saying anything is they just want to see what Trump can do. And I think all in all, they probably have to be pleased with the results of the summit. It's just like there is, again, they do to the extent that is possible. And I'm sure that they're not really hoping for too much, hoping for the stars. It's just if they can, again, kind of just maintain some kind of relationship with the U.S., keep lines of communication open, just kind of just lower the temperature a bit, then they can at least, again, I think they understand there's not going to be any real settlement. You can just see that, Trump there in the Oval Office and starting to waffle on all these other kinds of issues. There's not going to be an agreement. It's just not going to happen. And Zelensky is just, one thing that Trump would, if he was serious about this, and if the Russians really did make some sort of offer on Donetsk, he should be coming down on Zelensky hard. Hey, you got to do this. This is your chance. And if you don't, we're cutting it off. I'm just telling you. But he's just like you pointed out, he wants to be friendly to everybody. And then there he is with Zelensky, and he's getting chummy with him. He said, this is not going to work. If you're going to have to if you're going to really push something through, you got to apply some pressure to the other side. You just have to. And he just seems to be incapable of doing that.
Well, unless the idea was that just be chummy. It's like, okay, look, now you two hash it out. I'm out. I mean, that's what he should be doing, right? And that's what we thought possibly. Maybe that is his plan. But let's just see how much he wants to stay involved. But I think part of the problem is also that Trump's ego is so big that he wants to be involved. He likes being the one in charge and telling people what to do and put people together and make things happen. And it's like, hey, actually, dude, just step out. This isn't, get out of here, but I don't think he will. But you hear J.D. Vance echoing that type of sentiment, though. He does seem to really generally feel like let's get out. And this is something that the Europeans, this is their continent. They can handle it. Let's just just bail, pull the ripcord. And maybe eventually that will happen. I mean, that's all we can hope for, is that eventually the U.S. will leave, and then this whole house of cards falls down. It's going to be chaotic, whatever happens. But we could avoid World War III. And I think Trump wants to avoid World War III. I think he's genuine about that. So we can maybe feel safe about that. But for Europe, though, I just don't. I don't know what do you see the future of Europe looking like? I just doesn't seem very bright.
Yeah, no, it's yeah. I think those leaders. We've all seen the photos of the European leaders in the White House, kind of like they're at the yeah, before the God Emperor. And yeah, it just sums it up. They have so completely, subordinated themselves to the U.S. They have embraced their status as vassals. They had a chance, you could say, with Trump, who was, clearly at odds with the Europeans in so many ways, well, not just vis-a-vis Ukraine, but on trade and whatever. Say, well, okay, enough of this. Maybe this is our wake up call. Europe needs to stand alone, and there you got talk like that. But when push came to shove, it seems like they decided, well, on the other hand, maybe we just got to go and lick his boots, and that's what they all agreed on. That's nobody just said, I'm not even going. This is stupid, and I'm not agreeing to this tariff deal. This is nonsense. If they're going to slap these tariffs on us, we're going to retaliate, because we're a sovereign nation. Yeah, I understand there'll be economic consequences, but we're a sovereign nation, like the Indians did. Yeah, they said, okay, of course, they're a lot larger, but if you are, if you do take your own sovereignty seriously, that's what you do. And they say, we're going to, this is an arrangement that is obviously not to our benefit. There's a whole world out there. It's not the U.S. is an important partner in so many ways, but there's a whole world. And we can actually, by being sovereign, or by choosing really to relate to all these other centers of power, we can stand independently and proudly and be our own nation. That's something that France or Germany or, Poland or any of these countries could choose that option. But they didn't. They all chose to, bow down before the God Emperor.
But could they choose that option at any moment? Like if there's a new party that gets into power, could they immediately just switch that and be like, okay, we have sovereignty? It almost feels like Europe doesn't have the ability to be sovereign because the U.S. has been working, the EU and it has all these institutions in Europe that really kind of control it. I mean, NATO itself, their whole defense is us. So I feel like they're captured, and I think the United States kind of knows they have them captured. Because clearly the normal response is what India did, or like Brazil. Lula's just said, like, look, we don't need an emperor. We have our own nation. You can't just slap tariffs on us because you don't like some political case that's going on in Brazil. Get out of here. This isn't your continent. That's just such a normal response. Yeah, don't tell us what to do. You stay over on your side of the pond.
Yeah. Well, you're right. That is a healthy response, and that's what you would expect. I think Europe, if even certainly a generation ago, I think you would see at least some of that response. Maybe France. I remember, I'm just remembering the Iraq War. Of course, France actually stood against the U.S. and opposed, the U.S. invasion of Iraq. But not now. I mean, it's just like on all these geopolitical questions, it's just like, whatever the master says. Could they break away? They could, but you're right. It would be hard because there are these institutions in place, and above all, the EU. Of course, there are a couple of countries that have been trying to assert their sovereignty within Europe, namely Slovakia and Hungary. But they're under tremendous pressure, but you can see, even though they're small countries, they've managed to survive. There are the people in Brussels are cooking up all kinds of schemes to get them, and maybe eventually they will. But so far they've survived. Now, a larger country, I guess what it takes is like a France or a Germany to say, we're out of here, and we're gonna, we're not going to be, part of this. We're not going to be a vassal. So we're out of NATO. We're out of, out of the EU. We're going to stand as an independent country. And of course, there are, potentially like the AfD in Germany could do that. They do want to adopt an independent geopolitical position.
Does that mean pulling out of NATO if you're an independent geopolitical position?
I don't know. I don't think they've gone that far, but potentially, I think eventually you would have to. Really,
right?
I think so. I think eventually too, you have to say we're out of the EU. It's just you really can't have it both ways. Within the EU, it's just like you're giving them power over yourself. You can fight, just like Hungary is fighting, but they do have a lot of levers. They have a lot of ways to apply pressure, and so I think I don't know that anybody's openly talking about that. I know like the National Rally is dropped its anti-EU stance. I think that was from well before the time that they became the National Rally, and in many ways really have compromised. I don't think if Marine Le Pen, she actually wins, she and her party, the National Rally, I don't know that there really would be a radical change of position. You kind of think because of the way that the establishment parties react to them, that they must be very radical, but they're really not that radical. I think the AfD is more radical. But in all cases, they're up against a fight. Of course, like the AfD is up against quite a fight within Germany itself, and then there's the EU on top of that. The establishment is quite powerful, even when they don't really have the popular support. They do control the institutions, and they make it very, very difficult for real dissent to ever gain a foothold within the government.
Why do the European leaders want to be part of NATO so much? I mean, it just seems like a pretty bad deal. You have to, they're talking about trying to put 5% of your GDP. I don't know how high they're going to go. But you're spending tons of money. And from what we've learned and what they are all very well aware of is that, hey, we're spending all this money for all this NATO equipment, and then we just ship it to Ukraine, which isn't even a NATO member, and then it all gets blown up. And we just keep doing this again and again. And we're paying more and more money. And now Scott Bessent is saying, well, we'll add an extra 10%. We'll just keep on selling you guys weapons. And we just charge whatever you want. And you can only buy our weapons because you're part of NATO. So you got to spend so much money on weapons that don't work. You're not able to go out and on the free market. And then the other crazy thing is just that, like, what has NATO done for you? All it does is you're absorbing the problems of smaller countries every single time it expands. Like, surely there has to be some kind of reality, within that's like, why do we want to be part of this? It sounds like a horrible deal. It sounds like a great deal for the United States. Everybody join NATO, buy our weapons that don't really work and are very expensive. Like, I don't get it.
Right. Well, yeah, no, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It's just part of this. I guess it's again this abiding faith in Western hegemony, and Western hegemony has to be U.S. led. It seemed like again for a while the Europeans were talking about, okay, maybe we got to carry on Western hegemony without our leader, early in the Trump administration, but it seems like they've made the collective decision is that no, we just all have to bow down before the leader, and we'll get through this. They just can't seem to bear the chance idea. I think it's strange, but there's this abiding faith in this Western system and NATO and whatever. This is an institution, NATO, that has really completely outlived its usefulness. It should have been disbanded in the 1990s. After the fall of the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union fell, the reason for NATO's existence, ceased to exist. But instead of, just kind of folding up their tents and going home, they decided to expand eastward against their own, promises. It just, it's kind of institutional inertia, lack of imagination. It's just like, this is the formula for success, or NATO, is the most powerful military alliance in the history of the world. the EU and the West is, that this is the center of the world, economically, politically. All of these things are ceasing to be true, but they can't let go of it. And Russia is a basket case, and they just need to be told, accept the truth of our superiority and bow down before us. And, Russia's failure to, I know it sounds so weird, but it seems like that, that's what they were expecting. It's just like, okay, we're going to impose sanctions on, because of course they're just totally dependent on us, right? So we're going to cut them off, and then they're going to collapse. And then
I don't believe it. I don't believe it. Right? But, There's no way.
But how else do you explain it? I mean, this is really the way they seem to think. And then it's, they're going to collapse, and then, everything will be as it should be. Everything as it should be was like the way it was at the end of the 1990s. And it's sort of like, Russia's refusal to go along with this, its failure to collapse, and then its progress on the battlefield. All of these things are kind of like, to them, it's just like a nightmare that they need to wake up from and then get back to the reality of the way things should be. They just can't seem to accept it. It's just like if you say, okay, yeah, the world's changed. Okay, the balance of power in Europe has changed. Let's live with this new reality and work with it. But no, it's just like the insistence, like, we're just going to go to yet another, package of economic sanctions. Again, it shows that you believe, that you are so important to Russia and to the rest of the world that you can just simply, by severing that economic relation, they've done it like 99%, but if we can get another 0.1% or what, at some point they'll just fall because they need us, because we're just so important to them.
It sounds hard to believe. I mean, because it's been 3 years. All right. I give them benefit of the doubt in the first year. Right. But right. I mean, look how much time, and you just say we have all this faith in NATO, and they got this formula of success, and we have this superiority, but we just have this hard reality that, like, the problem is, like, even if you want to buy the weapons, we don't have them. They know that. They know that, like, Switzerland is like having to delay its Patriot battery for 10 years or something because, there's none left. So we say, well, hold on the war. In 2 more years, we'll produce another battery, which the Russians will just blow up anyways. And each one of those cost $1 billion for a system. And every missile costs, like 3 million plus or something? Of 6 million for yeah. Okay. And it's right. Right. So it's just, the whole thing is just ridiculous. Like, the idea that somehow they still believe this is just so hard for me to believe, because it's just, they have the realities on the ground. It's like, what can you do? You don't have any weapons. You just don't even have them, and then what you do send doesn't work very well. So
I know, but it's just, no, it's amazing. But actually, you still, again, if you just look at the mainstream media, the narrative hasn't changed. It's just like, it's just become, they're doubling down on it. Again, Russia is just in the past couple of weeks, I read a number of Russia's on the verge of economic collapse kind of articles. Of course, these have been coming out for months, years now. Actually, even before the SMO. And it's never true, but it still keeps on coming out. So they do seem to believe in it. And what just the other day, it was Macron that said that actually the story that the Ukrainians are on the back foot, that they're losing the war, this is fake news. No, the Ukrainians are doing great. He insisted on it. And you just wonder, I don't know, does he know he's lying, or has he just decided to believe these people all have sycophants around them who want to please their respective presidents or prime ministers, and they just tell them what the Ukrainians feed to them. This is, again, which is always that Russia's suffering horrific losses. Russia's on the verge of collapse. You just have to hang in there just a little bit longer. I get the sense that a lot of them actually believe in this.
It's crazy. I saw a news headline in RT, and I just read the article, but I don't know if this has been confirmed anywhere else, is that there were Russian hackers that got the data on dead and missing Ukrainian soldiers. And they had 1.7 million, and the names. And so I don't know if that's verified, but we've been talking about like it's got to be over 1 million from many different sources. People like Colonel Douglas McGregor, whatever. Nobody knows for sure, but often the numbers that I hear being thrown around that within the dissident community is something maybe like 120,000 Russian soldiers and over 1 million Ukrainian. And now, if this is true, and if this leak, that this hack that these Russians got of the database becomes verified, and we know that indeed let's say over 1.5 million, we'll say, died. We don't know how many were missing, how many are dead, but let's just say 1.5 million. And then and then at the end of the war, we see that there was maybe around 100,000 Russians that were killed. Like, what will that do to that? Just that fact in itself, I think, will just be so damaging to NATO's reputation and just the West overall. Any ability of us telling the truth, that we said that Russia was engaging in human wave cat tactics, that we said that the Ukrainians were doing great and we just got to keep on helping them a little bit more. And we were just sending them into the meat grinder, just slaughtering these boys, and then the ratio was 15-1. Every Russian that died, there were 15 Ukrainians that died. Like, that is so horrible, just so horrific, just killing all these men. And for what? Saying that somehow you're going to take down the world's largest country in terms of landmass, the take down the country that has the most nuclear weapons. This is insane. Like, I just, how will that in itself, if that fact comes out and we see that, couldn't that just destroy NATO? Shouldn't that just destroy the West narrative? Like, we not only are we evil and we're liars, but we're weak on top of it. We don't even have anything to back it up. We're just evil monsters, and we're not even strong. We're just puny little weak evil. I don't know. You know what I mean? It makes me mad. Just the thought of almost 2 million people that Ukrainians that die before this is over. If we're already at that number and they're going to keep it going, like, this whole generation, you have destroyed that country. That country is gone. If they're the ones that, if you think about, if that many have died, think of how many have fled. Just what lives are these people going to have? If you're a kid there, people don't have fathers anymore. The women, how do they support their families? Their husbands are all dead. Like, it's so tragic. It's horrific. And we don't, and it's on a huge scale. I don't want to compare it to Gaza, because what's happening in Gaza is just absolutely heartbreaking in the most horrific thing, because it's intentionally murdering these people. But we're talking about huge numbers. More people have been killed in this war. And just that ripple effect, how that impacts, the people, the family members around them, their kids, future generations. Like, this is so damaging. It just, anyway, I'll get off my soapbox. I don't even have a question here.
Right. Okay. Well, yeah, no, that's an important story. We don't know yet, but we should know one way or the other, I think in the relatively near future, because this can be verified or refuted. Again, according to the hackers, they have, the names, pictures, the circumstances of death, next of kin, all of that. And if that's true, they can publish that, and the Ukrainians can show this is all phony, show, these people are all here, they're all alive, thousands of them or whatever. Inevitably there will be some mistakes. So if they find 3 guys that are alive, that doesn't prove anything, right? But they can disprove it if in fact they publish it. But if they can't, then we know it's true. This is something that can be verified. So I don't think that the whole thing, the trove of data, has been published yet. I may be wrong. Maybe it has been. But if it is published, we will learn one way or the other. Whether or not this is true. The number they gave was 1,721,000. Yeah, and they broke it out by year, and it showed that there's been a real acceleration. Not, we're talking about tens of thousands of deaths in the first year, but it goes up, quite a bit in 2023. That was the year of the big, summer offensive. But then another leap forward in 2024. And this year is on pace to, maybe 1 million deaths or 900,000 deaths in this year alone. It gets worse and worse according to, the data according to their breakdown of the data. Yeah, we'll have to see. I mean, this would be, I think should be a huge blow to the Ukraine project if this is verified. And we still don't know yet. I noticed that there was just a really violent emotional reaction to this story. I was just scrolling through the different Western and Ukrainian press reports, and it was just all that this has been refuted, this has been debunked, this is nonsense. The Russians, fake news by the Kremlin, this is the way it's portrayed. But I go into the article and no, they haven't refuted it. That's a word that's often misused now to say you haven't proven that it's untrue. It's just that their so-called proof or that it's untrue is that basically the Ukrainians deny it and say it's untrue, and that everybody knows that more Russians have died. It's just assertions of the previous narrative, but they don't offer any proof of it. So yeah, we'll see. I mean, that's quite a large number. The Russians themselves, the Russian Ministry of Defense has estimated that 1.08 million Ukrainians have been killed or severely wounded. So it would actually be quite a bit higher. But that's certainly possible because, again, these are estimates. I don't know how the Russians can really know how many Ukrainians are dying on the other side. They get a sense of it, of course, when they do a rapid advance and they collect the bodies, which, we've seen that happen. But in general, these lines are moving quite slowly. So they're making these estimates, but they can't really know. When you hit a concrete fortification with a fab bomb, you don't know how many guys are inside there. Sometimes maybe you pick up some sort of radio transmission, but you're not always going to get it. So we'll see. Maybe it's true. It's really a horrifying number, and if it is verified, then that should be a huge blow to the Ukraine project.
Right, especially because Trump seems to believe the inverse. He seems to believe the Ukrainian numbers. We see him retweet like, "Oh my goodness, already 1 million Russians have died this year," or whatever it is. Right. He says, just insane numbers. Only 8,000 Ukrainians have died. Right. And something like this. Right. I mean, I remember Zelensky a year ago or so, like after the summer offensive, said that there's 34,000 Ukrainians. And then you're just thinking like, if you lied by a factor of like 100, or 50 or whatever.
Well, I'm sure. Yeah, the Ukrainians just can't believe Zelensky on this, and they probably believe something closer to that number that's been revealed because you can see that from their behavior. Again, we're talking about the press gangs. You don't run from a press gang like and they don't have to be chasing people down in the streets. If in fact, the numbers are as low as what Trump and Zelensky are claiming.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, but it's clearly they're afraid. People do not want to go to the front in Ukraine. They don't know the exact number, I'm sure, but they've heard enough, from friends and, classmates and so on. And family members, they say, no, don't go there. It's a death sentence. And so, people swim across the rivers, they hide in their basements, they dress up as women, whatever it takes. I think the conduct, it doesn't prove exactly what the number is, but that it's high, that there is real fear within Ukraine. And that's why they're having so much trouble finding anybody to actually go to the front. And you just don't see the same thing. In spite of all these stories about, a million dead a year in Russia or whatever, there's just nothing like that. I haven't seen one forced conscription video in Russia because forced conscription doesn't happen. They're getting in more than enough people. Yeah, by offering them good packages. But again, if you think that there's a really good chance you're going to die, you're just not going to do it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's just open admissions from the Ukrainian side as well that they have a manpower shortage. This isn't hidden. And so you wonder, like, well, what does that mean if you have a manpower shortage? Well, it's because they're all dying. That's what it means. That's the horrible truth. And it just feels like you wish that someone like Trump could put that together. I think J.D. Vance understands that, but I just don't understand how somebody cannot figure that out. That I saw an article saying that Ukraine is looking into like using robots to solve its manpower shortage. It's like, well, okay, yeah, if you're going to robots, it's because you killed all the humans are dead. Like this is what you're saying. It's just, it's really awful. Well, it seems like it's going to continue grinding on. I don't see this. I don't believe that there's going to be any type of peace. I think this is all noise. It sounds like you feel the same way. So it's just going to continue to be a tragedy. It's going to, I think we'll probably see, more rapid advances. I imagine, and we'll just see what the U.S. does in response, I guess. But yeah, no, I don't think any peace is on the horizon. You agree, right?
Yeah, I do agree. Yeah.
Okay, well, let me move over to the Middle East.
Okay.
So I'll segue to it by something that Lavrov said that I thought was quite interesting. He was saying that the West is delaying the recognition of the Palestinian state. They're doing that until there's nothing left to recognize. And we actually heard Smotrich say basically the same thing. Like, if they do it, then we won't give them anything left to recognize. And Lavrov said, why are you waiting 2 months? Why not recognize it immediately? And so that made me think, like, could that actually be the plan of the people in the West? They will threaten, like, okay, we'll recognize a Palestinian state in the future, couple months. And then Israel just continues its genocide, begins annexing the West Bank. And then when 2 months come up, if they're not finished, like, well, you better do it. We'll do it next month. And just push it down until all of a sudden Israel has taken the West Bank, has completed its genocide, now controls all of Gaza, all of West Bank. And then they say, well, we wanted to do it, but, we were just a little too late.
Yeah.
Is that the plan? Is that?
I don't think that's the plan. I think it's just a response to pressure, from grassroots. These governments understand that the support for Israel has become real unpopular, and it could mean, defeat at the polls. And so they have to do something, have to do something to demonstrate that, okay, yeah, we're not completely with the Zionists. Yeah, we are concerned about Palestinian suffering. And they've just decided that, well, maybe the best thing we can do, the least costly thing that we can do, because it's really just a gesture, is to recognize Palestinian statehood. It really doesn't do anything, I'll be honest, for the Palestinians.
But why not do it immediately?
The idea is that, okay, you're going to give the Israelis a chance to, reach a ceasefire. Say, okay, we're going to hold this out. Look, Israel, we're kind of mad about what you're doing here. We're going to give you a little time to think it over and then to do the right thing. I think that's the argument that's being made anyway.
So do you think that they will recognize Palestine in the next, 2 months or so?
Right. I think.
Do you think will there be something left to recognize, or will we see like a full-on invasion of the West Bank going on at that point? So what's the point of recognizing it when already?
Well, in a way, maybe it's not a full-on invasion, but there is. The invasion of the West Bank has been going on for decades, and it's been accelerating, and it's really intensified again since October 7th. So the invasion is already happening, and it's been happening. I don't think you're going to see a full-on invasion. The IDF is really tied up in Gaza. They have begun their operation to occupy Gaza City in North Gaza. Apparently they've already, and they're calling up reserves, tens of thousands of reserves to do this. I just don't think they have the reserves for a full-scale invasion of the West Bank.
Do they even have the reserves for the invasion of Gaza? Because I heard you mention 100,000 reservists, but then I'm seeing stories that they don't even have that. They're having trouble calling people up. Do you know the situation?
Yeah, well, this is a very unpopular move, and it was resisted by the IDF leadership. I guess it's the chief of staff, Samir, argued very strongly against it. He was saying that basically what you're saying is that we just don't have the manpower to do this. This is a big city, but Netanyahu put his foot down, and they're doing it. It's going to, it's going to be somewhat rough on the IDF, but of course, much, much worse for the Palestinians. It's already begun. And Palestinians are already dying in large numbers because of it. And others are fleeing once again, just like to another designated safe zone that's not safe. They'll end up in a tent city and then the tents will be bombed. We've seen it happen, again and again. And they know it, they just don't have any choice. They're seeing entire blocks are being leveled. Entire neighborhood is being leveled now in Gaza City.
It's crazy. So this invasion, is it happening right now?
Yeah, it appears to have begun. Yeah.
Okay, so we can just expect the carnage to increase then, is what we're going to see.
Yeah, that's what we've seen already. It was like it had tailed off somewhat. It's awful. But I think just in the last 24 hours, it jumped up again because of the incursion, the invasion of Gaza City.
Just the hell that the Gazans are living in is just unimaginable. I can't think of anything more horrific than a place like Gaza. I mean, even historically, just being trapped in a place for years that's been constantly bombed, no food, it's be snipers, airstrikes, drones, and you just gotta, and if you want to get food, got to run to one of the 4 aid points for miles, no water, anything like that, and have fun because they're going to be shooting at you. They'll just throw the food down, and you better hope you don't get hit by a bullet, or a tank shell. It's wild. And then I also saw a story in the Jerusalem Post that because of the shortage of reservists, they're having trouble drawing up troops in the IDF. They are looking into the Jewish diaspora for troops to join, and they mentioned specifically the United States and France to try to get soldiers, young men between the ages of like 18 and 27 or something is what they're looking for, to come over and fight and join the IDF and go to Gaza. Like, first of all, is it, you're even allowed to do that? Can Americans go serve in a foreign military government specifically to commit war crimes? I mean, that's what we're doing in Gaza. If you're going to Gaza, you're committing war crimes. I mean, this isn't a war. This is a war against the people, right? This is an annihilation of a people. The idea that somehow you're fighting an army is absurd. So will there be repercussions? Will they have success? So the people can just go there and go kill children as an American citizen and come back to this country, no problem?
Absolutely. Nobody has ever suffered any consequences for joining the IDF. That's happened. We have people in Congress that have served in the IDF, people in the in the administration. Yeah, and there are never any consequences for the operations that they take part in.
There's one consequence. At least there's, hopefully we can have more and more of a social consequence, that the Israelis are afraid to show their passport. And good. They should be. You should be ashamed of your country. And anybody that joins the IDF, that needs to be a black stain that will be on there with them forever for what they've done. And that is a consequence. They will be known, as this is something that you joined to partake in a genocide. Our government is too complicit to do anything.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah. So, well, do you think that they'll be able to get many people? That we'll see. I'm sure they're already, probably not, right? Who wants to go there? Because, like I'm saying, unless if you are a person that's willing to leave France or the United States to go to Gaza, then you got to be one of the most evil people on the planet, right? I mean, like, what your goal is? You going to go there to kill civilians? And everybody you should know what's going on by now. And you're willing to risk your, and it's dangerous, and you're still willing to risk your life to kill women and children?
Yeah, well, I don't know. Maybe some people don't fully understand. They've been brainwashed. They only watch Fox News or something. But that seems unlikely in this day and age. So we're talking about younger people, of course.
Right.
It seems like they have to know to some extent. They have to know. Maybe they don't realize the full horror, but they've got to know that a very high percentage of the people killed by the IDF are civilians. So yeah, no, it would. yeah, what can you say about those kind of people? Somebody, I don't think there are too many of them, but I may be wrong. Even within
Right.
Israel, of course, it's becoming increasingly hard to get people to show up. And that's one of the reasons, of course, that this call has gone out to the diaspora.
Right. So I don't imagine many people will answer this call, thankfully. Will this put some, I mean, it just sounds crazy that, that will this put a limit on Netanyahu's ability to take over Gaza and the West Bank if they just don't have the troops? If they're having trouble with Gaza, I mean, the West Bank, it's going to be something different, because if they go into the West Bank, I think at some point the West Bank isn't boxed in like it is, like Gaza is. Like you have the Jordanian border. More than half of Jordan or Jordanians are actually Palestinians that have been pushed there. So you're going to be able to. I think the Jordanian government won't be able to survive an incursion into the West Bank.
Yeah, and there's a much larger population of Palestinians. Trying to remember what it is. It's like 5 million in the West Bank versus 2 million in Gaza. So you're talking about many more people, more land, and a long border with a state that is more than half Palestinian. Yeah, you're right. They've, like, in the last couple of years since October 7th, they have accelerated their land grabs. And they have kind of dealt out the Gaza treatment to certain communities like Jenin, up in the north, and that's the community that actually visited. But to actually like ethnically cleanse the West Bank would be such a huge undertaking. We can see what's happening in Gaza. And it would again just be 5 times what Gaza was. And again, if Israel is starting to feel the heat from it, they should be feeling a lot more heat, and they should be real sanctions, of course. But they are still feeling it. They understand, I think, a lot of them, that they've become international pariahs. But all of that would just be, taken to the nth degree if they tried to do the same thing in Gaza. Now, they are doing a lot in Gaza, but but still, they're not giving all of the West Bank. I should say they're doing a lot in the West Bank, but they're not giving all of the West Bank, the Gaza treatment. If they went there, and I'm sure that people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir actually do want to do that, but I know you would hope that at that point the world would say enough.
How does this all end?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean. And, I guess the thing is, it may be that, again, Netanyahu clearly has chosen a course of ethnic cleansing. They are trying to, the hope is actually to drive all of the Gazans out. And if you can't do that, maybe at least to drive them all into southern Gaza and seize the north, something like that. But it's not clear, and that's, that may be the reason for this operation against Gaza City, which is in the north. But it's not completely clear that he can even do it. Again, this is where they're coming up against the wall. They just don't have the willing young men, to carry this out. They don't have enough of them. And so it's possible. And then there are pressures within Israel that really want to bring about an end to the war, at least for the time being. And bring all the hostages home. And those pressures are considerable. There are a lot of people who hate Netanyahu and want to replace him. So, I mean, it's possible that just kind of through exhaustion and, domestic political strife, that this whole effort might come to an end for at least a while. I don't think there's any reason to really be hopeful that it's not going to continue at some point in the future. I mean, the forces are there. And again, you look at you do get these contradictory signals. People want to bring the hostages home. A majority of Israelis do it. But then very large majorities also just really want to ethnically cleanse Gaza. That's what the polls are telling us. So how is that going to all play out? It's hard to say. And it may be that there could, that Netanyahu might be forced into some kind of ceasefire, at least a temporary one. Apparently, Hamas has agreed to a 60-day ceasefire and, the release of like half of the remaining hostages. But Netanyahu is going to think up excuses for not agreeing to that same arrangement that was worked out between, I think it was Egypt and Qatar on one side and then the Hamas on the other. And now it's been turned over to the Israelis. But I think Netanyahu, he doesn't want to do it. I think essentially, it's actually Smotrich and Ben-Gvir has told him that if he agrees to it, they're out and that his coalition is going to fall apart. So, he's in a difficult position. He always seems to, like a Houdini-like, to extricate himself and to survive for another day. But maybe at some point, his luck will run out. His government will fall apart. A new government will come in. It's not going to be, a government that's going to admit to what's happened and express regret, or anything like that. But they will bring the hostages home and at least give the IDF a rest, But you're going to have that same sentiment, unfortunately, within Israel that the Gazans need to go.
Do you have accurate, up-to-date information on the demographics of Israel? I'm wondering if they're having trouble calling up reservists. Part of the reason might be is that the population has been declining, and or part of it also is that maybe some of these people they don't believe in this war. Maybe there's a bit of a conscience in some people; they don't like the idea, or maybe it's just the self-preservation factor. But they're not signing up, and if that. Any of those things, though, the idea of self-preservation for Israelis, if they saw what happened in Tel Aviv and Haifa when Iran was striking, they're like, maybe this place isn't so safe. Maybe more and more people are starting to stay sad. We're always the victims. We're always hated around the world. True, maybe they're okay with that. But I think of many of them, maybe over time, that they start to think, it's really not that great being the most hated person, country in the world. Everywhere I go, I'm afraid to show my Israeli passport. I'm afraid to, say where I'm from. Like, that can't be nice. You think that in itself is going to be putting pressure on, just the demographics of Israel, that Jewish Israelis will slowly move. And I'm sure we saw a lot of people leave during when Iran was striking. Netanyahu didn't want people to get out of the country because a lot of them were all on boats heading to Cyprus, and they realized that, hey, getting in and out of this country, we are surrounded by people that hate us because we keep killing them. We can't go through Lebanon. We're not, getting out through the West Bank or through Jordan could be tricky in the future. Getting out, you can't go through Egypt could be tricky. And we have one airport, the Ben Gurion airport, and we're not all coming out there. It's and I don't know if they'll be taking buses to Amman, if they try to go into the West Bank. That's not going to happen. So what do you think?
Well, yeah, I haven't actually recently. There was, I think in the early months of the war that some hundreds of thousands of Israelis fled. Now, some of them came back, but I think others also left. I don't know what the exact figure is now. I just don't know. In the articles I've read about the reservists, mainly they point to just exhaustion. Again, this was sort of the deal. Again, we have short wars. And then, you're called up, but then you go back to your normal life. And now they're getting called up again and again. And a lot of them are just burned out, exhausted. And their families don't want to see them go. Their wives, their employers. And so many of them are just saying no. And then there's also the political factor. That's what I understand, is that a lot of people are against this particular operation because they see it as a cynical ploy by Netanyahu to stay in power and at the expense of the hostages. And, that's a big deal within Israel to bring all the hostages home, even though we're only, of course I'd like them to come home too, but we're talking about 30 people, maybe 25 or something. And that's, every day, so many children or often many multiples of that die in Gaza. But that's the morality. That's the concern within Israel. And so anyway, they see it as a cynical ploy again by Netanyahu that will be carried out at the expense of the hostages. So it's quite unpopular. Again, obviously not among all Israelis, because Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, they clearly have their supporters. But there is a large segment of Israeli society that's dead set against this operation. And so they just may, for, kind of political reasons, in addition to just personal and family reasons, to reject it. That's the understanding that I gained from, reading these articles in Haaretz.
Yeah, I just see the nightmare just keeps on going and it just never ends. It just, the one thing that we talked about potentially bringing down the U.S. empire, and I'm wondering if this could have an effect on pulling the plug on on Israel, is that if our economy just collapses, I feel like I feel like we're at this stage now where the whole U.S. financial system could collapse tomorrow or 5 years from now. It just seems like things are just so out of control. The debt is over $37 trillion. More and more countries are abandoning the use of the dollar. We have the whole BRICS movement is becoming solidified, really unified thanks to Trump and our attacks with these tariffs. The whole thing just seems like it doesn't seem like it can last long. So if there is an economic collapse, would that also bring down the state of Israel, because Israel relies on the United States? I've seen quotes. I don't know if this is a real quote from Benjamin Netanyahu. I've seen it around on Twitter that in the 90s, Netanyahu said that essentially that the United States is the fatted calf, which we will suck dry basically and cut off, sell off piece by piece until there's nothing left but a welfare state, which we will run. I don't know.
I'm not aware of that.
I don't know if it's true. I've seen it around, but
I have my doubts because I've heard a lot of quotes from Netanyahu over the years. I mean, he has bragged, and I've actually seen the video about how he basically can control the U.S., that he can just
I've seen that one.
Yeah. Bragging to some settlers about that. But I've never heard that. Not impossible, but I've never heard it. I mean, you can say it may be essentially, if he didn't say it, he's probably thinking it.
He's probably thinking it, right? I mean, that's basically what they're doing, right? That's what they're doing. But eventually, but we are their life source, right? Without the United States, Israel doesn't exist. So if there is an economic collapse, how would it be okay that we continue to send billions in aid to Israel when everything has gone to hell here? It's like they can't do it, right?
I mean, what was it that Nancy Pelosi said? Like, even like the Capitol building could burn to the ground, but we still, we would have a relationship to Israel.
I hate this country. I hate this country.
I mean, really, that's what you have. You have people that have actually said that, this is even more important than the welfare of the United States. And we do have people like that. I think, by and large, the American people do not support that, and actually it would provoke a very strong reaction. But we may come to that state, where there is severe economic difficulties in this country. It becomes increasingly difficult to send billions overseas, and that'll put I guess Trump is, at least for the time being, has set up something so that we're not sending billions to Ukraine. We're apparently going to be making money off of Ukraine. We'll see how that works. But we continue to send the billions to Israel, and it may at some point become, there's not really much resistance to that, unfortunately, at this point. But the resistance will grow, if and when economic difficulties increase in this country.
This country is just completely infested with traitors. Come election year, I'm becoming a one position guy, and I think more and more people are going to become a one position guy, and that is, what's your stance on Israel? And that it's kind of, this for me is, I just morally we have to take a stand here. Like, this is the most important thing. So I want to see all these people out of office, and I really hope it comes. And in the midterm elections, all future elections, I want front stage and center. What's your stance on Israel? And I want them to be able to see that. And anybody that says, I stand with Israel, you're out. You stand with America, you're an American. That's it. I don't want to hear it anymore. And I hope more and more people, I think more and more people are coming to that. And I think that this is going to be an issue front and center by the time, the midterms come up, and just any political elections. I think this is going to be it. This is becoming
Well, let's hope so. certainly there's signs of that.
It's going to be a political death sentence to support Israel. That's what we need to make it.
Yeah.
Anyways, okay. Well, you got me all worked up this morning, Dad.
Okay. Well,
Okay.
Your day is just beginning. My day is coming to an end. I'm here in Iston,
Yeah.
and but we fly home to the good old U.S. of A. Tomorrow morning.
Yeah. Right. I'll pick you up. So I'll see you tomorrow.
You better. Yeah.
Yeah. Don't worry. I'll be there.
Okay.
Okay, Dad. All right. Well, enjoy your evening in Istanbul. I'm looking forward to hearing all about it. Yeah, maybe on Saturday when we do the next episode, you can tell us a little bit about your trip. I know I think some people are interested. That some people ask some comments. People want to know your experience in Russia.
Yeah. Yeah. I can talk a little bit about both.
Okay. All right. Well, have a good rest of your evening, Dad.
Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.